Also perched on my balcony with me was a stoutish man called Mr. Smith. He was some kind of farm worker and came from Tetbury in Gloucestershire. He looked quite smart in his own green dressing gown, not a standard hospital issue 3/4 length piece of toweling like the rest of us. A softly spoken man in his 30s, he had a round face and a full head of black hair. I used to feel quite sorry for him, as he never had any visitors whilst on Bud Ward. There was a surplus of visitors around my bed, though, as I by now had made many friends through school, football and work, not to mention visiting relatives. When I asked Mr. Smith about this, it turned out he lived with his elderly mother and had no family, and the journey's too long for me mother down from Tetbury on the bus. Some of my overspill of visitors would end up talking to him, and my soft-hearted mother would often leave him a few loose cigarettes on his locker before she left the hospital. Amazingly, yes, we could smoke away quite happily on Bud Ward. The other interesting thing about Mr. Smith was that he was a twitcher. He knew a lot about birds, and up on that balcony was the ideal place for a twitcher. He would be forever pointing out the sparrows, wrens, tits and blackbirds that would perch on the balcony rail or on prominent jutting walls or roofs. Mr. Smith could identify them all. Not that it interested me too much, for I was far too engrossed in my own stuff. In fact, my deaf ear was usually in place when his soft Gloucestershire burr might say, "Dozens of small birds down there around the church spire. Think those magpies must scare 'em up there to gather." Prominent in our foreground was a church called St. James's Priory. Legend had it that every 10th stone brought from Normandy at the time of the conquest to build the castle was set aside to build the priory, and now that the castle is long gone, these stones are like an echo from 1800 years ago. I wish now I'd listened a little more to Mr. Smith. He might have opened my interest in the natural world a little earlier. As it was, the raising of the shutters on my eyes to nature was put on hold for many years, regrettably. In another bed on that balcony was a Mr. Carter. He was a middle-aged man and clearly very ill. Unlike the rest of us, he remained permanently in bed, and the screens were often around him as the nurses tended to his needs. Sometimes I would stand at his bedside and try to talk to him, but he could only whisper his responses, which didn't make much sense anyway. I recall holding his hand on one occasion when he pushed it towards me from underneath the sheet. Things were really nosediving for poor Mr. Carter, and there were considerable comings and goings of white coats to his bedside, both day and night. Finally, it was finally, as those screens stayed around his bed all the time, and the news filtered out that Mr. C was no more. It wasn't my first encounter with death, as very shortly before this time both my father and my Nanny Webb had died, both within a few weeks of each other. Mr. Carter's demise, especially being so close, drawn out, and under my very nose as it were, reinforced a message I had already begun to understand, that in life there is death. It wasn't all doom and gloom up there on Bud Ward. Once I started to feel like a normal person again, it came increasingly to my attention that inside those starchy uniforms, underneath those little caps, beneath those severe hairstyles, and within the black stockings and flat shoes, were a number of good-looking females. It wasn't long before that chemistry was bubbling up nicely. In particular, it was starting to fizz a little with one of the night nurses called Vivian. Not a name we come across too much these days. but quite a popular name for girls back then. Anyway, somehow Viv would find more and more time to spend standing and chatting, whispering actually, to me at my bedside, especially during the quiet dead of night. It wasn't too long before she'd perch on the edge of the bed, and not a whole lot longer before holding hands and snatched kisses became the order of the night. Trouble with snatched kisses is they always sort of want to last a little longer. Now Viv was a pretty enough girl, but she did have rather prominent front teeth. She was aware of this herself. She'd kissed the boys before, and before the actual meeting of mouths she would try to push her lips forward so as to lessen the risk of those forward gnashers bashing into the recipient's own front teeth. Sadly, this well thought out technique wasn't always a winner, and there was just no kissing Viv without the very uneasy and unsexy and uncomfortable clunk of tooth enamel colliding. Also, it took a little moment for her to get lined up before going into forward gear in order to attempt a successful docking. This was all well and good until one night Viv and I had successfully locked on when a very slight cough from the balcony doorway revealed the presence of a visiting night sister on her checking round. Well, a hugely embarrassed and terrified Viv shot into the air and retreated back into the main body of the ward to await her fate. Happily, it didn't turn out too badly for her. After all, snogging with the patients in the middle of the night was a sackable offence by any standard. It turned out that the sister involved was a compassionate soul, and Viv got a warning and moved on to another ward. We even had a few dates after I left hospital. We would meet under the clock on St. Augustine's Parade on the centre, commencing point for countless Bristolian romances down the years. One thing though, often people look more attractive to the opposite sex wearing a uniform than in their ordinary clothes, in mufti, as nurses used to refer to it. At the time Viv and I had a few dates, the fashion was for girls to wear a very big hooped skirt. It was like walking around with a miniature roundabout. Not very practical either for going through doors or squeezing past other people as you got off or on a bus. An utterly daft fashion, as a matter of fact, and one which mercifully didn't last too long. Anyway, Viv and I never reached our secret hospital heights of passion out in the big wide world, and things cooled off between us fairly rapidly. Must confess though, that ever since then, girls with protruding teeth have never really done it for me. I have to be honest.